Keanu Reeves stood in the first-class line, dressed in a simple plaid shirt, worn-out jeans, and scuffed boots. His calm demeanor and minimalistic backpack were a stark contrast to the luxury that surrounded him. He didn't attract much attention, except from one man. Behind him in line was Gerald Stone, a sharp-dressed businessman in a tailored suit, polished shoes, and a cologne that announced his arrival before he spoke. Gerald's demeanor exuded a need to assert dominance. His eyes scanned the line with practiced arrogance before landing on Keanu. A smirk played on his lips as he muttered under his breath, "First class, huh? You never know who might show up here these days." Keanu turned slightly, meeting Gerald's condescending gaze with a calm expression. "Yeah," Keanu said simply. "The world is full of surprises." Gerald expected more. A reaction, a flustered reply, but Keanu remained unfazed. This quiet confidence seemed to irk Gerald, who decided to push further. "Look, nothing personal," he began, chuckling softly. "But you don't really look like the first-class type." Keanu didn't flinch. "It's rare to see someone so casual in first class," Gerald added, smirking at his own words as the line began to move. The two men boarded the plane. Gerald walked with a practiced stride, his every move designed to impress. Keanu, by contrast, carried himself with an easy calm, seemingly oblivious to the world around him. When Gerald checked his seat number, his smug grin faltered. Of all the places to sit, he found himself right next to Keanu. "You've got to be kidding me," Gerald muttered, shaking his head as he slid into his seat. Keanu glanced over and offered a slight smile. "Looks like we're traveling together." Gerald let out a chuckle. "Of all the seats, it had to be here," he said, trying to mask his annoyance. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Gerald couldn't resist starting a conversation. Not out of friendliness, but to probe. "So, what do you do for a living?" he asked, feigning casual interest. Keanu, adjusting his bag under the seat, replied simply, "I work in film." "Ah," Gerald said, raising an eyebrow. "Commercials? Indie stuff?" Keanu gave a small, almost amused smile. "Something like that." Gerald leaned back with a self-satisfied grin. "You know," he said, "it's fascinating how people find their place. But let's be honest, not everyone belongs in first class." Keanu met Gerald's gaze, his tone steady and calm. "I think we all have our place," he replied. "And sometimes, it's exactly where we are." As the plane soared into the sky, the flight attendants began the first-class service. Gerald Stone, eager to assert his status, made his presence known. "A glass of champagne, please," he said, flashing a confident smile. "Something that matches the exclusivity of this seat." The attendant nodded politely and turned to Keanu Reeves. Without hesitation, Keanu made his request. "Just water, please." Gerald couldn't resist commenting. "Water?" he asked with a chuckle. "Don't tell me you're going to waste the experience of flying first class with water." Keanu took the bottle handed to him, his expression unchanged. "I'm fine with this. Sometimes simplicity is enough." Gerald narrowed his eyes, his smile faltering. "I guess that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer." Keanu raised the bottle to his lips and took a small sip, giving no immediate response. Passengers around them began to notice Gerald's pointed remarks, but Keanu's calmness seemed to diffuse any tension. Finally, he said, "Maybe the best is different for everyone." Gerald scoffed, clearly dissatisfied. "Or maybe people who say that just never had access to what really matters," he said, leaning back smugly. The flight attendant glanced at them from across the aisle, her professional smile faltering slightly as she gauged the tension. Yet Keanu appeared unbothered, returning his gaze to the window. Gerald wasn't done. He adjusted his tie, leaning forward as if preparing for another round. "You know," he said, gesturing with his champagne glass, "life is like flying first class. You work hard, earn your spot, and get to enjoy it. But some people, well, they're only here because they got lucky." Keanu turned from the window and met Gerald's gaze. This time, there was a subtle firmness in his tone. "Luck or hard work, We all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we? The words hung in the air like a challenge. A few nearby passengers exchanged glances, sensing the subtle shift in the conversation. Gerald laughed, though it sounded forced. Sure, that's a nice thought. But some of us are on a higher level, living the dream, so to speak. Not everyone understands the value of being here. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his arms resting on the tray table. The value of being here, he said, gesturing around the cabin, isn't about what you have. It's about how you treat others. The cabin fell silent. A few passengers nodded discreetly, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Gerald, however, laughed dismissively. First-class self-help philosophy, he sneered. Maybe you should consider giving motivational talks. Keanu offered a short, measured smile and turned back toward the window, ending the conversation. His silence spoke volumes. Around them, whispers began to circulate. Some passengers shot disapproving looks at Gerald, while others exchanged quiet words of approval for Keanu's restraint. Gerald, for all his bravado, began to sense the shift in the room. But he wasn't ready to admit defeat. The in-flight exchange had drawn the quiet attention of the other passengers. While Gerald Stone kept his air of confidence, his irritation was starting to show. The calm responses from Keanu Reeves were not what Gerald had anticipated, and it was becoming harder to maintain the upper hand. You know what's funny? Gerald began, his tone laced with condescension. People who have nothing to show for themselves always talk about things like humility and simplicity. Ever noticed that? Keanu, who had been calmly sipping his water, set the bottle down and leaned forward slightly. He looked Gerald in the eye, his voice steady. I've noticed that sometimes the people who talk the most about what they have are the ones who feel the emptiest inside. The words landed like a quiet thunderclap. Gerald blinked, momentarily stunned. Around them, the subtle reactions of the passengers told a different story than the one Gerald was trying to control. Some nodded, while others exchanged approving glances. Gerald opened his mouth but couldn't immediately find the right words. Finally, he managed, "Look, I don't mean to be rude, but the world is competitive. If you don't show what you have, people will ignore you. That's just how things work." Keanu sat back, his expression unchanging. "Maybe," he said, "but I think true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself." The quiet truth in his words rippled through the cabin. Gerald's confident facade faltered as he glanced around, noticing more and more disapproving looks from the other passengers. Yet he refused to back down. Desperate to salvage his pride, Gerald gestured broadly with his champagne glass. "Cheap philosophy," he said with a smirk. "It might sound nice, but the real world doesn't work that way." Keanu turned to him, his tone calm but firm. "The real world is made by people, Gerald. And in the end, how we treat others says more about who we are than anything else." For the first time, Gerald looked visibly uncomfortable. The passengers around them were no longer whispering. They were watching openly now. Some exchanged disapproving glances, while others looked at Gerald with expressions that bordered on pity. Despite the mounting tension, Keanu remained unaffected. He leaned forward slightly, his voice softening. "You know, Gerald, I understand what you're saying. The world can be competitive. But I've learned that sometimes the need to prove something to others comes from something deeper. An insecurity, an inner struggle." Gerald's brow furrowed, his earlier bravado now replaced with visible unease. "Inner struggle?" he repeated, laughing nervously. "I don't know where you're getting that idea, but you couldn't be more wrong." Keanu gave a slight smile and shook his head. "Maybe," he said, "but I've met a lot of people who thought success was about what others could see. Deep down, they were just trying to fill something missing inside." The words hit Gerald harder than he wanted to admit. For a moment, he fiddled absently with the wedding band on his finger, his gaze dropping to the floor. But he quickly recovered, his defensive tone returning. "That's not me," he said firmly. "Everything I've achieved, I've worked hard for. I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life." Keanu nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "I'm not saying you didn't work hard. I just think that sometimes we get so caught up in the idea of showing off what we've achieved that we forget to look inward. Who are we without all of this? The question seemed to linger in the air. Gerald pressed his lips together, visibly uncomfortable. He laughed cynically. We're what we build. Without it, we're nothing. Keanu's expression grew more serious. I disagree. I think we're defined by what we do for others, not by what we accumulate. And in the end, the things we show the world matter less than what we carry inside. The weight of Keanu's words filled the cabin. A few passengers nodded subtly, while Gerald shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding the gazes of those around him. His earlier confidence was crumbling, replaced by something closer to shame. But the worst, or perhaps the best, was yet to come. The cabin had grown quieter as passengers tuned into the tension between Gerald and Keanu Reeves. Gerald sat stiffly, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible discomfort. He noticed the eyes of the other passengers, curious, judgmental, and some outright disapproving. The silence was broken by the flight attendant as she approached Keanu with a polite smile. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice carrying through the cabin. "The captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The mention of his full name struck like a lightning bolt. Gerald froze, his mouth slightly ajar. Around them, murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers who had quietly observed the exchange now exchanged wide-eyed glances. "Reeves?" Gerald muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "Keanu Reeves?" Keanu, still calm and composed, nodded politely to the flight attendant and thanked her before turning back to face forward. His demeanor hadn't changed, but the ripple effect his name caused was undeniable. Gerald stared at Keanu as if seeing him for the first time. I had no idea," he stammered. "I mean, you didn't say who you were." Keanu met his gaze, his tone as steady as ever. "I didn't think it was necessary. I don't usually use my name as a calling card." The simple response left Gerald floundering. He glanced nervously around the cabin, now aware of the growing attention on him. "I didn't mean to," he began, his voice faltering. "I just didn't know who I was talking to." Keanu leaned slightly forward, his expression kind but firm. "What you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to. It depends on how you choose to treat people." Gerald's face flushed with humiliation as the weight of those words settled over him. The cabin remained silent, the tension thick as passengers observed the unfolding scene. For the first time since the start of the flight, Gerald looked genuinely humbled. His confident mask had slipped, revealing the vulnerability underneath. He tried to justify himself, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't mean to offend you. I didn't know you were..." He trailed off, searching for the right words. Keanu exhaled softly, leaning back in his seat. "Victor," he said gently, "life is hard enough for everyone. The last thing we need is people trying to put others down to make themselves feel bigger." Gerald nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to his hands. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was arrogant. I acted like an idiot." Keanu studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I appreciate the apology," he said. "But more than that, I hope you learn from this." Gerald sat in silence, the words resonating deeply. Around them, the cabin's atmosphere had shifted entirely. Passengers who had been amused or indifferent earlier now seemed introspective, affected by the exchange. As the flight continued, Gerald kept his head down, replaying Keanu's words in his mind. He had spent so much time focused on appearances and status that he had forgotten the importance of humility and respect. Meanwhile, Keanu remained as calm and composed as ever. He quietly read a book, seemingly unaffected by the scene that had just played out. Yet his presence left an undeniable impact, not just on Gerald, but on everyone who had witnessed the exchange. The flight descended into an almost meditative silence after the exchange. Gerald Stone sat in his seat, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. The arrogance and bravado he had carried into the first-class cabin had dissolved, replaced by an unfamiliar sense of humility. Keanu Reeves, on the other hand, seemed entirely at peace. As he turned the pages of his book, the simplicity of his actions amplified the lesson he had imparted without needing to raise his voice or engage in confrontation. His calm demeanor resonated with everyone who had been watching. The words Keanu had spoken echoed in Gerald's mind. Who are we without all of this? It wasn't just a rhetorical question. It was a mirror, forcing Gerald to examine himself in a way he never had before. The passengers who had silently judged the scene were now reflecting as well. Keanu's actions showed them that true strength doesn't come from status or possessions, but from the way we treat others. As the plane began its descent, Gerald mustered the courage to turn to Keanu. His voice, usually brimming with confidence, was now quiet and earnest. "I need to apologize," he said. "Not because but because I was wrong. I was arrogant, and I acted like a fool." Keanu set his book down and met Gerald's gaze. "I appreciate the apology," he said with a slight smile. "But what matters more is that you take something from this experience. Sometimes what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves." Gerald nodded slowly, his eyes clouded with thought. For the first time in years, he felt a desire to change. Not for appearances, but for himself. As the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, Gerald lingered for a moment, watching Keanu. Fans had discreetly approached the actor, requesting photos and autographs. Keanu greeted each one with patience, kindness, and a genuine smile. There was no rush, no pretense. Only a man who carried himself with humility and grace. Gerald sighed, his heart heavy with both regret and hope. He realized this encounter had been more than just a coincidence. Perhaps it was a chance to start over, to shed the weight of pride and arrogance he had carried for so long. Section 5.3, The Final Lesson. As Keanu disappeared into the crowd at the airport terminal, Gerald whispered to himself, "Maybe it's time to figure out what really matters." Keanu's words and actions had left an indelible mark, not just on Gerald, but on everyone who had witnessed the exchange. The experience served as a powerful reminder that true success isn't measured by wealth or status, but by the kindness and respect we show others. In the end, Keanu Reeves had shared a simple but profound truth. The things we accumulate in life matter far less than the legacy of compassion and humility we leave behind.